good evening. Another day, another live stream. It's a chilly February night in the UK, but I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you've had a good start to the weekend. And as you can see by the title, in this live stream, I'll be talking about fear, which is a topic I've certainly covered here and there in different videos, but this time around, I'm providing a different perspective because I had a recent revelation on my own understanding of my personal fears and where they come from and how I can deal with them going forward. And as a result, I think a lot of guys could take some value from this recent revelation, especially if you're somebody who's fairly introspective and you somewhat are interested in figuring out the inner workings of your mind and trying to understand where certain habits or behaviors or beliefs of yours may come from, and also trying to understand why it feels or why it sometimes feels as if you can never quite get a hold of those fears, right? You can never quite conquer those fears, which of course is a very big part of getting good at code approach, right? It's all about conquering your fear. And so, obviously, fear is a very common topic. Of course, it's one of the most prevalent human emotions that binds us all together. And so, I think it's important to be a bit more specific about these sort of topics because people talk about fear all the time, but rarely do we really dive deeper beneath the surface. And I think it's important. I think it's valuable. It's certainly helped me. And it just gives me perspective by allowing myself to detach from certain emotions. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So, fear is obviously it's a very powerful emotion, and I think the first point that I want to make is that you as a person or me as a person, let's just talk about me, right? So, I'm Ian. I've lived a life. I have an identity. I have this body of mine. It's quite evident that I'm a person, right? And so when I look at myself, I think of myself in a singular concept or from a singular perspective, meaning I is just one, right? It's just me. But when you dive beneath the surface, in reality, I'm not just. It's not sim. It's not. It's too simple and it's too inaccurate to just see myself as one version of myself, right? Because the reality is that I have lived for 28 years and I have many different experiences and I've lived through different phases in life. And I also have different, let's say, personalities that I display. And not from an inauthentic point of view, but just because it wouldn't make sense to just be the same kind of person or have the same temperament in every single situation. So, for example, when I'm with my grandma and we're having a chat, it's not the same version of Ian that has a couple of drinks with his mates at the pub, right? Like there's a difference in the type of Ian that shows up. Now, you can I'm still authentic in both scenarios, right? I still try to be authentic in both scenarios, but evidently that version of me with my grandma talks about different topics, has a sort of different demeanor, and even conducts himself differently in general versus the more loud, maybe more boisterous, maybe more animated version of me that you'll find at the pub with my mates on a Friday night. And so once you understand that, then you realize, okay, so obviously Ian isn't just one singular person in a more, let's say, spiritual or identity sense, right? Physically, yes, I embody this one body, but deep down inside, there are multiple versions of me, right? And there is some alignment between all of those versions, but at the end of the day, they sort of manifest themselves or they act in different ways. And so once you recognize that, well, then you tie that into the aspect of fear and you realize that if I have different personalities and I have, let's say, different sub identities, then that must mean that those sub identities react differently to the concept of fear. Or a simple way to put it is those identities are scared of different things. So, for example, I have a very, let's say, ambitious and driven, risk taking personality or side of my personality that isn't afraid of, let's say, messing up, or isn't afraid of making mistakes, or isn't afraid of judgment, or isn't afraid to try different ideas because he's objective and he's ambitious and he's willing to, do whatever it takes to achieve a certain goal. So that's one way that my more ambitious side handles, fear, or maybe even has a lack of fear when it comes to going after what he wants. But then on the other hand, there might be the, let's say, younger version of me who, for whatever reason, is afraid to take risks, is afraid to put themselves out there because that version of me, based on experiences in the past, didn't fare well when he took risk, and therefore he shies away from risk in the present day. And so I know this is a bit, some might think this is woo woo, but I think this is very important, at least it has been for me, because this has been the first step in me identifying where this fear is actually coming from. Because if we think about these different sub identities or personalities, then you realize that a big distinctive factor between each one of these identities is when they were, let's say, when these identities sort of sprang to life. So, in the context of code approach, right, let's really drill it down here. So, there's a side of me, right, as a younger kid, let's say, there's a sub identity of mine which was born when I was in school, right? And it lived throughout high school, through to college, and maybe even to university. And that personality has existed over that entire period. So it could be, let's say, 15 years of my life, which is more than half of my life, right? And so that personality, right, has developed fears based on negative experiences, i.e., getting rejected, also based on what other people might have said, i.e., maybe being made fun of, also based off influences, whether it's on the internet or TV shows or movies or even just wider societal norms, right? So if you know about this concept of mimetic desire, it's this idea that we tend to emulate what other people do around us just because it's what the herd does. So that could be another influence, right? And so this personality of mine, which is like an entity, it is a personality and it's real. It's not like a physical personality, but it exists within me at some level, right? Mentally. This side of me has been fed, right? And it's been fed, or rather, it looks at the world with a certain perspective, and it creates a certain narrative about certain behaviors, right? And so that let's say that younger version of me who's been through all those experiences and had all those influences, that version of me, when you take him, when you look at him in the present day and you put him in front of a certain activity like cold approach, well, of course he's going to be extremely afraid, right? He's going to be very scared to pull the trigger and do an approach, or stick in a conversation or close for a number, right? Because his idea of an approach is basically wrapped around this really big fear of rejection, embarrassment, disappointing friends or disappointing family, or being ostracized by a society or the community or whatever the case might be, right? And so that's the paradigm that specific younger version of me, who, as like I said, has 10 to 15 years of conditioning behind him, That's the way that he approaches that particular activity, right? But then you look at a more recent version of me, let's say the more courageous version of me, which was born very recently, right? So imagine I kind of see myself as somebody who, you know, my I see the current version of myself, which I'm proud of. I see that version of me as being born the day I did my first cold approach, which kind of sounds crazy, but the reason why is because that was one of the biggest fears that I ever had. And so to overcome it, it almost took me, or it almost required me to be reborn. It almost required me to develop an entirely new identity that was completely different to my old identity. And so that's why I sort of see myself nowadays as that version of me. And that version of me obviously is only a year and a half old, right? Because he was born on that day. And so now if we take that identity through the same assessment process, that version of me, his fears or the way that he approaches the fear of approaching is very different, right? So obviously I spoke about experiences, right? So the younger version of me, which obviously didn't have as much, let's say, wisdom, he took rejection very personally. But the older, more recent, courageous version of Ian, who was born last year or a year and a half ago, he views rejection completely differently, right? So through his own experiences, i.e., all the approaches that I've done since then, which includes both a bunch of, let's say, rejections, but also positive experiences, well, his takeaway in terms of, the fear of approaching is very different. He's not as afraid to approach. In fact, he's not afraid to approach at all, right? Because he understands that that's just part of the game. That's just part of the process, right? And so that version of me has had lots of positive reference experiences, lots of positive reactions. So he's built up a completely different perception and belief system around the process of approaching. So it's not as scary for him to push himself into an approach, right? Same goes for influences. So I mentioned earlier how my younger version or that younger identity that is afraid, very afraid of this type of stuff, he's been influenced by certain media, certain TV shows, certain societal constructs. But this older version, this newer, courageous version of me, he's been watching the right type of content. He surrounds himself, or I surround myself, with people who align with my belief system, right? Guys like Ephraim or guys like Christian. I consume content or I stay away from content that negatively impacts my my belief in code approach or my belief in my attractiveness as a man, and I essentially have curated the right content diet to consume. And so therefore my influences are positive, right? So I have positive influences that essentially build this identity of mine, this new identity of mine. It builds me up every single time I consume the right kind of content. Again, like if we're talking about influences, I am a part of a community of guys. I have guys in the community that I'm a part of, with Ephraim, who are like-minded, right? Guys who push me after a rejection, guys who encourage me to keep on approaching, guys who want to see me grow in this skill set, right? And so this new identity of mine, he has a completely different belief system, a completely different way of reacting to rejection, a completely different self-concept, right? And as a result, he views the world differently, and as a result, he can easily get over his fears. And so the reason I make this distinction is because I realized something the other day. So I was out in my session in London, and I noticed that even though I went in for my approaches and even though it went pretty well, there was that the fear was still there, right? And I've done almost 1,000 approaches. So it got me thinking, it's interesting because I've had so many positive reference experiences, and yet if I get rejected, even nowadays, if I get like a blowout, for example, there's a part of me, a very small part of me, that still feels pretty like bad about it. Now, it's not as intense as it used to be when I first started, right? But it got me thinking. I was like, it's funny because I would have thought that after all these experiences, after all the dates I've been on, now I'm seeing a girl here in London, all the amazing, amazing experiences I've had abroad in different countries, you'd think that by this point I would have completely eradicated the fear, right? But I realized that no, the fear is still there. And after reflecting, I realized I think the fear is there because it's not necessarily the case that I'm afraid, meaning me, like, it's not as simple as to say, oh, I'm still afraid. No, the real way to look at it is that younger version of myself is still afraid. And that younger version of myself, we could call it like my old frequency, that version of myself still stays with me to this day. Even though I'm a new person, and even though a newer version of myself was basically birthed, right, when I did my first approach, there is still that, like I said, older version of myself that has 15 years of conditioning, 15 years of negative self talk, 15 years of a, you know, insecurity, deep seated insecurity about how he looked and how he came across to girls and his attractiveness, and 15 years of comparing himself to other people, 15 years of being a people pleaser, 15 years of all these different negative traits that obviously will all coalesce into somebody who is afraid to put themselves out there on the line, right? And so that version of me, he still exists and he's not going anywhere. And that was the light bulb moment. I realized that version of me, I mean, he has 15 years of existence. So of course he's not going to go anywhere overnight. Of course he's not going to go anywhere in a year and a half. I mean, that would be preposterous. That would be ridiculous, right? So then it got me thinking, okay, but then how come I'm able to push myself even though the fear is there? And then I realized, oh, it's because that new identity, the one that was birthed on 14th September 2024, he's the one who goes in for the approaches. He's the one who doesn't give a fuck about what people think. He's the one who goes after what he wants. He's the one who takes all the risk. And even though he only has a year and a half of existence, he is powerful because he's had some powerful positive experiences that give him enough fuel and energy and belief to go after what he wants. And so if you really think about it, when you're about to do an approach, when I'm about to do an approach, there's this conflict between that new version and that old version. And that's where the fear affects both of them. Well, sorry, the fear actually affects the older version of me who's afraid, but it doesn't really affect the newer version. But like I said, that older version has a lot of power. That older version has so much staying power and influence because he's been with me for so long, and so it feels way more familiar, right? So it's easy to slip back into that way of thinking. It's easy for me to slip back into that old frequency. And here's another unfortunate but real reality about what happens when, let's say, I get a blowout, right? Or I get not a blowout, but like let's say a more brutal blowout, which doesn't happen as much anymore, but it can still happen every now and then, right? And so if you think about the way that people handle rejection, again, let's speak for myself. If I think about the way that I handle rejection, nowadays, the rejection is sort of, I think what ends up happening is I get rejected, and then because in the split moment that it happens, there's a tendency for my, let's say, my brain to want to interpret it in a, let's say, a negative way. So in that moment, I get rejected, and then my older version of myself wants to take that rejection and go down this negative self-talking loop, right? This, let's say, self-destructive narrative of, you see, this is why rejection is bad. Rejection is terrible. Now I feel like a piece of shit. Now I feel ugly. Maybe it's because I'm not good enough. Maybe it's because I'm not strong enough. Maybe it's because I'm not as cool as the guys that were cool in my year group. Maybe it's because I'm not funny, or I'm not interesting, or maybe it's because my hair's a certain way, and it goes down. Maybe it's because I don't make this much money, etc., etc., etc. Add the insecurity. It doesn't matter. That's what my older version of myself wants to do with that rejection, because that's what it's been trained to do. And think about this, guys. Like, it's easy for me to say 15 years, but like, think about how many like weeks, days, hours, minutes that I've spent in that negative self loop. And it all happens here, right? And so when you do that time and time again, yeah, no shit that that version of me, that entity that lives within me, right? It feeds off that rejection. It feeds it and it takes it as proof that, I am not worthy, I'm not this, I'm not that, I can't do this, I'll never get her, I'll never do this. And this is why I fucking love Cold Approach, because it literally opens up your mind to realize that's what's going on. And that's the same, and you can apply this to any area of life. It can be the reason why you don't want to apply for that job. It can be the reason why you don't want to start that business. It could be the reason why you don't want to go up and make that friend. It could be the reason why you don't want to go and travel. It could be the reason why you don't want to take this risk or that risk. It's because there's a version of you, an older version of you, that is so afraid because it's been so conditioned to take all these negative experiences and to almost you know twist them and change them in a way that basically causes you to self-destruct, right? Or it just causes you to paralyze and to take no action at all. And so that's what's really going on in that moment. But then we switch over to my newer version, right? He takes the rejection and he just takes it on the chin. He doesn't care. He doesn't see it as a big deal, right? And so it's so important to make that distinction, because when people talk about fear, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that, you're not really afraid of it. It's not you, it's like a version of you, right? But if you can just tap into the newer version of you, or tap into another version of you that is the opposite of what you used to be, and really just understand that, okay, I feel afraid and it's real, because the fear is real. I'm not here to downplay the fear. The fear is legit. You know, when we talk about fear, it's important to note that there is a physiological element to fear. Increased heart rate, sweaty palms, restricted throat, your chest feels tight, you feel paralyzed, you kind of feel like you can't move. Like, these are all fears that guys have, whether it's approach anxiety or stage fright or fear of talking in public or whatever the case might be, right? Everybody knows what it's like to be afraid, right? There's like a legit visceral feeling associated with fear. So it feels very, very real, right? But I don't think guys are actually afraid of that physiological feeling, because that physiological feeling is temporary, right? That biological feeling of fear, especially within the context of cold approach, is temporary. Guys, I've done hundreds of approaches, close to 1,000. Like, that feeling you get before an approach when you're about to decide if you're going to go in, it's temporary. And I know that. And also, you survive that biological intensity of emotion, right? I've survived it. Like, it's funny because in the moment it almost feels like your heart's about to jump out of your chest, and it feels real, right? Especially when you're just starting out that first ever approach. Yes, it legitimately feels like you're about to have a heart attack. So I get why people don't want to push through that kind of fear. But of course, once you've gotten over it, you realize, oh, what was all of this? I mean, now I'm a bit more relaxed. Now I'm chill. In fact, I feel very calm, right? So this is how you feel after the approach. So, of course, in that moment, you realize, oh, I don't need to read too much into this physiological manifestation of fear. I don't need to read too much into it, because I know it's a temporary discomfort. That discomfort is brief, right? So the fear isn't that. Let's get deeper. Like, the real fear is the narrative that will play after the rejection. That's the fear. Because the reality is that if you don't understand where that narrative comes from and you're not able to take a hold of it, then that narrative isn't permanent. Sorry, that narrative isn't temporary. That narrative is permanent. That narrative, that negative self-talk, that exists well after the approach, right? Especially if you're somebody who hasn't yet developed that self-awareness to realize who's at play here, who's in control here, who is taking that rejection, and as a result coming up with all these different negative self beliefs about what that rejection means about me as a person, right? Taking it personally, allowing it to destroy my sense of self-worth. That is the permanent part. Because if you're somebody who, again, like mentally you're a bit brittle, or you haven't been able to deal with those rejections, the chances are you take that rejection and it plays in your head, not just for an extra 10 minutes after the approach, not just an extra hour, but for another day, another 2 days. And it happens subconsciously, right? And so that's the fear. The fear is the rejection represents a negative belief that I have, and the rejection confirms that negative belief. And if I keep on getting rejected and my negative self-talk uses rejection as a fuel source, then yeah, that's going to continually happen the more I get rejected, right? And so that's what we're really afraid of. We're really afraid of facing that reality that, oh, so I guess I am unlovable. I guess I am a piece of shit. I guess I am ugly. I guess I am not worthy. That's the fear. Because that's, if you think about it, that is hell on earth. I mean, that type of self-talk is the kind of self-talk that, I mean, that just makes your life miserable, right? And so that is really what we're dealing with here. That is the fear. The fear is this being stuck with this, almost, it's like a tyrant. It's like a tyrant in your mind that will not let go of you. Even outside of the approach, it follows you when you're at home, it follows you when you're out and about in public, it follows you at work. And it's not like loud. I'm not, this isn't like me saying that I have like this loud booming voice, or I used to have this voice. No, it's like it's very subtle. It's very subtle. And it typically gets loud when you're about to go in for an approach, or it's very loud once you've been rejected, or whatever the case might be. And so this is really what we need to understand. And so the reason I think this can free you, or the reason it has certainly freed me a lot, is because now whenever I feel that feeling, I know exactly what it is. I know exactly where it comes from. And I also know that if I get rejected, I know exactly which part of my mind wants to take that rejection and internalize it in a negative way. And so I can put a stop to it almost immediately. All right. And so, and it's funny because you might listen to what I'm saying and think, damn, Ian, does that mean that we're hopeless? Because how on earth is, how on earth is the new version of me, the new courageous version of me that is 1 year old or 1.5 years old, how is he meant to battle against 15 years of conditioning, 15 years of negative self-talk, negative narrative, negative self-concept, negative self-beliefs? How is he meant to battle him? I mean, it's 15 years versus 1 year. I mean, clearly the odds are against you, right? But that's not true, because the benefit that you have on the positive side is that that newer, almost godlike, confident, courageous version of you is more recent. He gets the recency. He gets the benefit of recent positive experiences, right? And so you can tap into that, right? And you just have to make that mindset shift. It's all about framing. You have to frame it through his lens rather than frame it through the older version of you, right? And a great analogy to use, which is a story in the Bible, is the story of David and Goliath, right? So I won't go into the details, but it's a great story. It's a great parable, and it's essentially this story of, David was like I think he was like a shepherd, or like he was a son of some random person. Again, I don't know the details. Don't come at me. I'm not like a church person. I'm not a big Christian. I just like to read different passages that I think have a lot of wisdom in them. And so essentially, long story short, David is this pretty boy, not the strongest at all, very small, and he's not a warrior at all. He was just, basically herding sheep for most of his life. Um, and at some point, he came under the stewardship of, one of the kings. I think it was King Saul. It was, and David just was basically like the king's hand in like a more admin type of role. He wasn't strong, like I said. He was just a normal boy. And then at some point in their village, this big warrior called Goliath comes into the village and he starts, essentially causing havoc. And the people in David's, let's say, village and Saul's village, they're looking for somebody to fight Goliath, right? And obviously they're looking for like a fit, strong, muscular warrior who can, match this giant, right? Goliath was like this, you know, when I say giant, like the way he's described in the passage is, he was this brute, and he was, like 7 foot tall or 8 foot tall, and sure it's a bit exaggerated, but the point is he was almost inhuman. He was almost like a beast, and long and behold, David, through through the power of God, or through this like spirit that sort of came into him, he developed the courage to fight Goliath, even though everybody doubted him, even though people said, "Are you crazy? Like, why on earth would you do that?" Right? But he said, "No, I have the spirit, and I'm going to go and do it." Right? And he took that leap of faith, and he, eventually confronted Goliath, and he struck him down against all the odds. Right? And so even though Goliath had all this muscle and years of training and being in so many different wars, and he's renowned as this savage of a warrior, versus little David, who just folds clothes and makes the bed nice and smooth with no war experience. Like, the fact that David beat Goliath is obviously a testament to the fact that it's not just about like what we see on the surface, right? There is something deeper there. And of course, like, it's up to you to interpret what you're trying to take from that message. But what I take from it is there is this sense that we can tap into a different level of courage deep down inside, even if the odds seem to be stacked against us. And I don't know what it's like for everybody else. I'm just spitting my own experiences. And, I tend to look at things through like a mental, spiritual lens, because I think ultimately that's what really got me to where I am. And I found so much success through that. And I think there's so much wisdom in that. And so I don't understand people who like to shit on like religious texts, or the wisdom in the Bible, or whatever text it is, right? Whether it's by biblical, Quran, Buddha, Bhagavad Gita, I think it's called, or Hinduism, or whatever religious text, right? I'm not a big fan of, like, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important for guys to know, because I want to be more relatable and to show you guys a bit more into the way that I think. But I'm not a very religious person. I don't go to church. I'm not a big fan of religion as an institution, because I'm not very dogmatic. I don't believe in everything that's said. I'm more of a, let's say, I have like a very nitpicky relationship with these kind of texts, where I like to read them, because I'm always open to learning more wisdom, but I take what I think is useful, and then I discard what I think is just outdated and pretty ineffective, or doesn't really make any sense in my life. So I just think there's so many great stories that map onto real life, and this story is a great one for the concept of fear, because obviously I'm sure David was afraid of Goliath when he looked at him towering over him, but he didn't allow that to stop him from going after what he wanted. And so, to tie this back into the example I gave, it's like, you can be hopeful, because sure, the newer version of you, or let's bring it back to me, the newer version of myself, which was born about a year and a half ago, he's David in this story. And Goliath is the 15-year beast, or the 15-year tyrant that has basically led my psyche for a very long time. And yet, if you think about it, David won. David won that battle. My version of David won the battle against Goliath, right? And it's an ongoing battle, and it's it's not going to be easy, I guess, right? And so Goliath is still there, right? Goliath still exists somewhere here. But what I'm realizing is that Goliath, let's say Goliath is here, right? And he's this big. David, every time I go in for an approach and I have the right mindset, right? David gets a bit taller, a bit taller, a bit taller, a bit taller, and maybe even Goliath gets a bit shorter, right? And at some point, I don't know when that point will be. I don't think it will take 15 years, but at some point, I'll get to a point where the rejections just don't matter at all. I'll get to a point where the fear barely has a hold on me. I'll get to a point where the negative self-talk doesn't even exist because the new version of me that I constructed and created that on that amazing day in Covent Garden, that version of me who has done so much, that version of me that's done so many great things since then, even outside of Code Approach, right? Just taking risks and just putting myself out there and just transforming who I am as a person, even starting this channel and now wanting to help guys through this skill set and try to improve their lives and improve their dating lives, and just doing that with this amount of like belief, even if I'm still afraid, like that version of me, he's gonna grow every single fucking day, and he's gonna get stronger and stronger and stronger to a point where now the odds are even. Yeah, now the odds are even, right? And it's funny because I didn't need the odds to be even when I made that first step. So imagine who I'll be in 3 months. Imagine who I'll be in 6 months, right? And so that's the way that you should really you look at these fears, right? Don't look at them in this very basic ass 2D perspective. It's so much deeper. And again, this isn't for everyone. If you don't resonate with the way that I view this, then cool. Like it's not, it's just the way that I look at it because I'm very, I like to see beneath the layer. Um, and yeah, every day I'm trying to get wiser. I'm trying to get smarter. I like to understand the way that I behave. I like to understand why I behave the way I behave. And more recently, because of Code Approach, it really forced me to think about the way that I handle fear, because I think ultimately fear is it's the emotion that stops us from achieving certain dreams, goals, ambitions. That's the block, that's the barrier that we're all trying to get over. And so it makes sense to try and understand it, right? Instead of fucking doom scrolling on everything, wasting time doing this, wasting time doing that, let's like take a moment to understand who we are. Let's take a moment to really take a step back and understand why am I afraid of this, right? Why does this certain behavior, why does this certain goal seem so scary? Is it going to kill me? If it's not going to kill me, then why am I afraid, right? And so once you look at stuff through that lens, then all of a sudden everything opens up and you have a proper third level perspective. You can detach yourself from all the bullshit that stops you from achieving what you want to achieve. And so I hope you guys take a lot of value from that. That's where I'm going to leave it. Have a good night. Peace out.